Okay, today we're talking about the end of World War One, sometimes referred to as the failed peace. By the time we're done with this, the failed peace portion will make a little bit more sense. Or if you can put two and two together and figure out that since there's a World War Two, you can figure out why it's called the failed peace. Okay, so the main idea, what we want to take from this, we want to be able to describe Woodrow Wilson's peace plan known as the 14-point peace plan. What were the goals? What were the outcomes of the Paris Peace Conference? We want to be able to explain why the Treaty of Versailles failed to win support from the United States Senate. So let's start with that 14-point plan. All right, so there's 14 points, but we don't need to know all 14. Let's just look at the 5 major key points. If anything, if the rest of Europe was going to agree to the United States and Woodrow Wilson's peace plan, at the very least, he wanted these 5 points to end up in the final peace plan. The ultimate goal here is to prevent future world wars from taking place. And the way to do that is to focus on those long-term causes of World War I, which were militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. So how do we prevent those 4 things from happening again long term? The first key point of the 14-point peace plan is to end secret agreements and alliances. Remember, the alliances that formed prior to the war led to the escalation and scale of World War I. It's not just a one-on-one war anymore, it's multiple countries versus multiple countries. The second part of the 14-point peace plan, freedom of seas, freedom of trade, and a limitation on military arms. So key point number 2 is looking to end the whole militarism aspect amongst countries. The third key point, peaceful settlements of disputes over colonies. So this kind of like alleviates the imperialism issue. Remember the race for resources, when you had foreign countries, these imperial powers taking over smaller countries, telling countries how to run their governments. That never set well with different countries. That was the long-term build-up to World War I. So let's try and resolve those imperial issues peacefully. Let's give the sovereignty and authority back to those nations that are being imperialized. That'll sort of alleviate some tensions and some resentment towards those imperialist countries. Key point number 4, self-determination. Each country has the right to their own territory, their own forms of government. Again, this is emphasizing and trying to reduce the amount of imperialization that's been taking place. And the 5th key point, and this is Wilson's major key point, this is his brainchild, this is like his number 1 thing he really wants to push, is the creation of what's called the League of Nations. And the League of Nations is essentially a gathering of all of the world's industrial countries, a place where they can come together and settle their disputes peacefully as opposed to going to war. Part of the League of Nations consisted of this thing called the World Court, and this is where these nations would come together, sit down at a peace table, and try and resolve their disputes. In this political cartoon here, you can see this angry-looking dog. It says the dog of war, and on it he has a muzzle, that cage that's kind of encircling his face here. This muzzle is labeled the League of Nations. It's basically representing the idea that the dogs of war, we can hold them at bay with the League of Nations. This will put the muzzle on future wars, so to speak. So this was Wilson's big plan. This is his big idea, the League of Nations, to try and prevent future outbreaks of war. Hopefully the other 14 points would also prevent war, but if we had the League of Nations, this would be the ultimate stopper of future wars, bringing the nations together to settle disputes. All right, good in theory. However, not everyone in Europe is on board with the 14-point peace plan. That is great. You had European nations who were looking for what are called reparations. If you look at this word in red here, reparations is just referring to repayments, essentially. The Allied powers, particularly France and Great Britain, they want Germany to repay them for the costs of the war, both in terms of financial costs and loss of lives. So for every British soldier, male British soldier who lost their lives, the British government wanted compensation for what that soldier would have made in payments in his career. So let's say he had a wife and 3 kids. well, his job would have paid, for them to live. So now they want Germany to pay what would have been his salary. So you times that by how many other British soldiers died, that's a ton of money. So not just like paying for like the future salaries of soldiers, but the cost of destruction. So most of the war took place in Europe, like France. We have to pay to rebuild the countryside, rebuild French and British factories. All of this is going to be repaid by the Germans, according to the French and the British. So they're kind of straying away from Wilson and his 14-point peace plan. They're not really gung-ho. They're not on board with this whole 14 points and League of Nations idea. The Big Four, these are the guys who are literally trying to figure out what's going to happen after the war, who's going to get what, is there going to be reparations, what degree of reparations will there be. It's consisting of the major Allied countries that participated through the war to the end, Wilson of the United States, Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, and then there's Vittorio Orlando of Italy. They're a big industrial country, so he kind of gets a say in it too, even though they were neutral. Now, the problem with the 14 points, especially the League of Nations, is that even though Woodrow Wilson can push for this plan all he wants, it's not up to the president to determine foreign policy, foreign contracts. That's the job of the Senate. Remember, in the United States, the system of checks and balances. No one branch is stronger than the other. This is one of the checks that the congressional branch has on the executive branch, is that when it comes to foreign country or foreign treaties and policies, it's up to the Senate to ratify them. So when it comes to the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, you have these group of people within the Senate who are pushing this isolationist view. They want to keep the United States isolated from foreign affairs, especially European affairs, and they felt that something like the League of Nations, which would bring all these foreign countries together to try and resolve issues, they felt that this would bring the United States unnecessarily into the fray, bring them into these conflicts or disputes unnecessarily. So they said, let's just not participate in this thing at all, and we don't have to worry about anything ever. So Europe, you deal with your problems. United States, we want to be more isolationist. All right? So the Senate blocks it. The League of Nations goes forward. The European nations decide, like, hey, it sounds like a good plan, but ultimately the United States does not partake in the League of Nations. So here you've got the world's superpower, the United States, emerging after World War I, not partaking in the League of Nations. So it's got all these powerful countries, but it's missing the most powerful country. It's missing its strongest potential leader, the U.S. We're not involved. And ultimately, this is what's going to lead to the failure of the League of Nations when you don't have their key, most powerful country involved in it. The Paris Peace Conference. So to end a war, you have a peace conference. In 1918 to 1919, we're trying to figure out what to do, who gets what after the war, and how are we going to treat Germany going forward. How are we going to make them pay these reparations? Are we going to make them do reparations? Europe is totally on board with the reparation idea. So the first part, the first result of the Treaty of Versailles is that Germany must accept blame for the war. They have to take full responsibility, and they're going to end up paying about a little over $300 billion in war reparations. And in 1918 terms of money, that is an astronomical amount of money. The other part of the Treaty of Versailles, it's going to limit the size of the German army. Notice the German army here up in the upper corner. Limiting the size. They're getting smaller. Okay. The idea is to prevent that militarization of the Germans. We don't want them to start another war. It's basically their fault, right? That's what the French and the British were saying. They started the war essentially. So to prevent them from starting any future wars, let's shrink the size of their army so they can't fight again. The fourth part, major fourth part for the Treaty of Versailles, is going to strip Germany of its foreign colonies. So all those hundreds of years of imperialization from European countries, what Germany had built up is now being stripped away. So it's going to severely impact the amount of resources they can bring in to their industrialization. It's going to limit the job production and trade. Taking away their colonies is going to severely hurt them. Let's just click that. The fifth part, Germany is going to give back parts that they had taken over before World War I from France. this region in red here in this map known as Alsace-Lorraine. This is important part because it's really rich in coal deposits and minerals and resources. Germany now must relinquish that, give it back to the French. So basically the Treaty of Versailles is dropping the hammer on Germany. Lots of reparations, accepting responsibility, giving up its colonies, giving up territory. This is a really, really harsh treaty, especially if you're Germany. And Germans are going to hold some resentment against the British and French for this for years and years to come. And it's one of the sort of long-term reasons, long-term buildups for World War II, these really harsh conditions from the Paris Peace Conference, which led to the Treaty of Versailles. So now where we go from here? The U.S. is returning to its isolationist policies, sort of, kind of. We're still pretty heavily involved in Latin America, South America. We're putting down revolutions. We're still sort of enacting that Roosevelt corollary, in effect. We're trying to maintain possession and resources in our own backyard. The United States is going to see a period of economic boom times. We're going to be very prosperous throughout the 1920s. This isolationist approach is going to be pretty beneficial from a political standpoint, from a cultural standpoint. Everyone's kind of content with just sort of like ignoring what's going on in Europe and focusing more on what's going on in the United States. And this kind of leads to our next topic in unit discussion, the Roaring Twenties.